We had to warn our employees that that they might have to deal with people coming up and giving them hugs. It checks off every checkbox in the requirements. It's ready to ship, and I get my hands on it for the first time, and I'm like, so like this just feels like kind of janky. Like it works, like it does everything it's supposed to do, but like it makes me just slightly annoyed the whole time I'm using it. People who loved our product and they were just using it wrong. They just didn't know what they were doing. So you're just like, no, click there, click there. And that last 10% of polish required twice as much effort. You can't just whine about all the things you want and complain that you're not getting everything you want. You need to put on your shareholder hat, and you need to start thinking as a shareholder and say, like, if I was an investor in this company, what do I think the company should do, and how would I think about these decisions? The day-to-day work of working in the healthcare industry is a whole lot less fun than working in a cool consumer-facing application. But when I look back on what we may have done years later, I feel like I have a higher level of satisfaction in the work that I did.
Hey everyone, my name is Arseni, and I invite you to join me to explore what it takes to make great products through the stories of people who've dedicated their lives to product craft. Today, in this very first episode of Product Craft, I'm thrilled to share my conversation with Dave Engberg. Dave is one of the smartest people I know, an incredible engineer and former CTO of Evernote and Livongo. After nearly 19 years in executive leadership, Dave decided to transition to engineering fellow role. We dive into the differences between mass market applications and healthcare and precision medicine domains, becoming an engineer, some exclusive insights from the early days at Evernote, Dave's transition from management back to an individual contributor role, and much, much more. This podcast is very much an MVP, if you will, and I'm still learning the ropes. Please subscribe to stay tuned for next episodes and share your feedback. I'd love to hear from you. Hi, Dave.
Well, hello. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So I wanted to rewind kind of to the beginning and ask you, how did you first get into engineering and programming?
Yeah. I guess as a semi-nerdy kid in the upper Midwest in the 80s, a lot of us ended up in computers for computer games, and you'd get in the computer classes, and it just sort of was a natural fit for kind of nerdy math kids like me. So I did a lot of that in high school, and then went to school at undergrad at Stanford, where there was a cross-disciplinary program called symbolic systems that involved a lot of computer science and linguistics and philosophy. And then one of the things I realized pretty early is that you're going to spend more of your life with your coworkers than most of your friends and relatives. So you should probably work with people that you like and respect.
Have you ever considered other careers or doing anything else, or did you pretty much go straight into engineering?
Yeah, I don't know. I think you hear advice from people who talk about, do what you love. So I kind of feel like do what you love as long as what you love is, database administration or something else.
You've seen it from the earlier days. You've seen the .com.
Yeah.
How would you compare kind of where it started to where we're now? Are we on a good trajectory, or how do things feel?
I think that the technologies and the craft and the techniques that people use have become more standard and more formalized, and it's more accessible to, I think, a wider variety of people. So I think that when I started engineering, you had to understand how memory worked in a chip. You needed to know more things to be successful. The field has changed, but I do think that the entry bar for working in product development in some capacity, being an engineer, being a product manager, being a designer, the entry level skill you need to be able to be okay is it's more approachable and it's easier now. I think that the bar to be really, really good, to be great, hasn't changed that much, because there's a level of problem, there's a level of complexity, there's a level of thinking that you have to be able to get to when you hit a wall. And I think that someone who's only done a couple of weeks of a boot camp, they might be able to follow some recipes when everything's going great, but when they hit a wall of understanding of why isn't this working, why does this not function the way it wants, without having the lower level foundations, I think that you can sort of strike out. So I think to be a really good staff engineer, principal engineer, systems architect, like that still this still requires you to roll up your sleeves and put on your hip waders and dig a little deeper and kind of understand like the why and the how of what's going on under the covers.
So it's almost like you can start faster, but then if you want to get good, you still need to come back to the fundamentals and dig a little deeper.
Right, right. Let's say that there's tools and techniques that let you do things with networks. They have your web browser talking to a web server, or servers within different services within a cloud environment talking to each other. There's tools that make that just so easy. They take care of so much of the grunt work, so you don't really have to think about it. But fundamentally, the communication from your web browser to some Amazon data center in Virginia, fundamentally the communication is limited by the speed of light. And if you don't really understand, like, each time you ask for something from Virginia, it needs to go speed of light to Virginia and some information comes back. If you can't really think about what's going on in the network at that level, you can use the really high level tools and then suddenly wonder, like, why is this horrifically slow? Why is this insecure? Why is this? There's a lot of ways that things can fail. And I think that, without understanding what's going on under the covers, sometimes those failure modes, you don't even know where to start and you have to ask somebody who's got a little more experience.
Yeah, I think about similar things from the design standpoint. I think everything moves more towards this like standardization, a
Mm-hmm.
lot more templates, a lot more out of the box solutions. The level of for entry is definitely lower. And then sometimes I wonder, like, well, do people miss something important? As you mentioned, like sometimes it is good to understand like the underlying, I don't know, physics and how electricity moves and how
Mm-hmm.
processors work. I remember I was taking a class at college for like black and white photography, and I
Mm-hmm.
remember like how through the process of seeing how the image comes on paper and how you like dodge and make things lighter and darker,
Right.
then looking at the Photoshop and like looking at levels and seeing tools like, okay, this is kind of, maybe you don't need to go that deep, but I sometimes wonder if it almost becomes too easy and whether the level of overall appreciation for the quality and for that craft becomes kind of lower, kind of like, oh,
Right.
I can do this. It's easier to do this now.
You're right, and I think photography is a great example. That 80 years ago, if you didn't understand how lenses worked, and you didn't understand lighting, and you didn't understand apertures and all that, like you couldn't take any pictures. Now, anyone with a recent iPhone, you can take amazing pictures, and you can completely ignore where the light is, where the what's going on. It'll just fix all your everything for you, which is fine. Which means that everybody can produce pretty good pictures under any condition. But if you really want to do something great, I think that not understanding what's going on in the lens is sort of a deficit. You don't understand that. I've seen people taking lots of photos where the sun is slightly behind the person they're taking a picture of, and they can click a button and fix it all. But everything ends up being a little washed out. Nothing looks quite as good as a well composed shot, and you're never quite sure why. But it's there. So I think that if you're building software that's an in-house application for people at a corporate call center, that really doesn't matter if they particularly like the application. All that matters is they can get it done. Then you can slap something together with templates and off-the-shelf patterns and just mock up something else, and that looks like something else you've seen. It works fine. But I do think that if you want to make a successful mass consumer application, I think that understanding what's going on in a user's head from user experience standpoint, and not just following off the shelf patterns is a great example where you have to think a little bit deeper.
You have a amazing range of companies that you were part of, and like a lot of names that are widely known. Evernote, Teladoc, Livongo, etc. And so, what is your definition of a great product?
Oh wow, that's a good question. I should have had the time to think about that one. Let me think. I do think that any product is trying to help people get some task done. A good product is one that is, it efficiently checks all the boxes. Yes, you can get your taxes filled out and get it submitted, and you'll eventually get a refund. That's a good product. I think a great product is one that goes beyond the bare minimum and tries to think a little more deeply about what the task is, how it's being done. I think a great product is one that tries to achieve the underlying objective in a way that innovates and that makes people even more effective in ways that aren't completely obvious. So I've had cases where product managers produce a list of requirements, and the designers go away and produce a set of forms or a wizard that exactly follow a list of requirements verbatim, and the engineers go and code it up, and it checks off every checkbox in the requirements. It's ready to ship, and then we've got a little bug bash or something, and I get my hands on it for the first time, and I'm like, so like this just feels like kind of janky. Like it works, like it does everything it's supposed to do, but like it makes me just slightly annoyed the whole time I'm using it. I think a really great product figures out how to absolutely minimize the amount of annoying stuff that I have to do as a user, and guide me the most elegantly towards a solution that solves my problem in a way that I don't really want to use delight, because I think there's really important applications that never experience delight. But I do think that it helps me achieve my objective in a way that's not obvious and is more elegant and efficient and than the obvious solution.
Do you think that that sort of gap between, like, here we have something that just checks the boxes, and here we have something that is kind of goes that extra mile and delivers a better experience, like, do you think that impacts the business bottom line, or not necessarily at all times?
I don't think I think that there are times where someone is building technology where there's very little or no material impact to a business to do a great job versus a good job, which isn't an excuse not to try. But I do think, like I said, like there's internal enterprise applications that are built at a company that are only going to be used at a call center for their employees, that obviously if you can shave the number of minutes per whatever down, that can have a material impact. That I think that helping people be more effective can usually have some measurable impact, but I don't think it automatically follows. In the open market of consumer applications with mobile apps, I think that it's a little bit more of a meritocracy, and a really great application developed and designed really cleanly is gonna be more popular than a half-baked embedded web app on the phone. But I don't think it's obvious that it's always going to win out or have a measurable impact in some of the places that I would consider an application.
That's one of the honestly primary focus of my personal curiosity, to explore that, because as as people who dedicate our lives to perfecting the craft, right, like whether it's engineering, design, or product management, we want to deliver the best possible thing. We want the solution itself to be meaningful, logical, beautiful, polished, etc. Now, from the business side, sometimes you don't want to maybe spend too much time perfecting something, right? So how do you find that balance between when to know when something should be just shipped or actually worked on more and get into the final level?
That's really funny. I have slowly accumulated lists of interview questions for different job categories because I've had to interview for head of X or head of Y. And yeah, the first time you interview for something, you just ask a bunch of really awful, dumb questions. And by the fourth or fifth interview, you finally realize what you should have been asking. So my interview question list in Evernote for designers and product managers, both of them, is one of the questions I always ask is, how do you know when a design is done? Like I feel like as an engineer, like there's always something more you could tweak, but how do you know when it's done? I asked the question. I don't feel like I have a perfect answer to it. I guess I think that we were sort of dancing around a little bit, and that what's the material benefit of the next level of refinement? Like how much could it benefit the organization, now and through the next few years to do another iteration, or to make it more advanced at a higher cost?
What did the people that you remember that you hired that were at the top, what was their answer?
I think that, quite frankly, a lot of people sort of give some, when you see a kind of answer, or just general, like I have a hard time getting people out of super high level answers and getting them into concrete territory. So a lot of times you'd get something that's basically like, once it achieves the business objectives, you got to ship it. But I do think that, I think that there's short-term and longer-term business objectives. Sometimes there are domains where having a distinctive, delightful user experience, for example, could have some follow-on benefits that you wouldn't be able to measure in the first week of metrics. I think that, again, things that are novel consumer-facing applications in app stores and on the web, that if you're trying to stand out as something new and you want to get social media to be talking about you, I think there's a pretty big incentive to have a delightful, innovative user experience. I think that if you're building an application for your a health insurance company, or for a hospital chain or something like that, that patients are going to log in and look at their medical records and test results, I think that there's probably less of a value of trying to innovate, and more of a, let's like follow standard patterns, put pretty standard forms, make it fast enough, call it a day. We have other business goals. I think that it's easy in Silicon Valley to kind of get to think in terms of top tier consumer tech companies and generalize from that. But I think most of the people who are building software on the planet are building something closer to, medical record system software, and they aren't building the next Instagram.
I remember Evernote, like the early days when it came out. I mean, I don't know if I remember it on the first day it came out, but I definitely remember that it stood out from other applications, had more personal branding, like starting with the color, with the brand identity. The UI itself was refined and it stood out from other things. I remember that kind of first impressions, like, oh, this is neat. This is cool. So was it intentional, like to merge technology with the experience side of things, or did it sort of happen by accident?
No, I think that was very intentional, to try to have a consumer experience that would stand out from what the norm was in early 2000s. And I think the bar at that point was luckily a little bit lower. Mobile apps weren't really a thing at that point when we first launched. Having something that was smooth and responsive and had a bit of a voice and a flavor and an attitude that was consumer focused. We could build native applications from the very beginning, a Windows application, a Mac OS application that you'd install on your computer, and it would feel just much better than the early Web 2.0 applications out there. We could do things that could just feel a lot smoother and more friendly to the consumer than some of the overloaded enterprise-ish stuff out there, like a lot of the office stuff with 28 tabs of preferences for you to wade through. Yeah, I know where all of that stuff could have come from. I can see how that happens organically, but when you're starting from scratch, you can do something that feels a little bit unencumbered from the past. But I think again that was an intentional choice, and I don't think it's the right decision for everyone who's building every piece of software. That was expensive. Building a Mac OS application required hiring people who could build software and installers for Mac OS. Same thing for Windows. And when the mobile phones came out, we built native applications there because you could only get so far with a web-based React embedded stack. And that last 10% of polish required twice as much effort, which if you're trying to get millions of consumers to use a consumer facing application, that's worth the investment. If you're doing something where the expected number of users, the frequency, the amount of minutes per user per year is lower, that might not be the right decision for everyone. So I think that the level of investment you put into the design and polish of an application has to be proportionate to the business value.
Who, how is it typically decided? Like, is it something that usually is decided at the executive level?
Yeah, I think that you look back at any successful startup and their origin story looks like destiny, but the fact is most startups you get a small group of principals together and they're kind of making a lot of seat of the pants decisions. At Evernote, we had a few early people like Phil Libin, our CEO, who were like he was a very, very product consumer visionary kind of guy. He cared a lot about the product experience and the innovation. He didn't care much at all about like enterprise sales and boring stuff like that. So we had a lot of early success because the people who cared the most in the early days, that was a priority for them. I wouldn't say like it wasn't like there was an MBA who was sitting there in QuickBooks trying to map out the exact right number of dollars per fortnight to put into product design and engineering. I think it was the people who cared and built that company were focused on that. I think that I have seen startups that have completely different origin stories. They're founded by salespeople or they're founded by doctors or someone other who doesn't come from a Silicon Valley product engineering consumer standpoint. And a lot of times their prioritization is different. They think a lot more about the market segments and how to sell into that. And once they've achieved the goal of selling into a particular market segment, there's not like what else, why are you putting more money into the software? And I don't think either one is wrong. I do think that any group of people who start a company are going to come from a certain perspective and have certain biases, which can give you a lot of strengths in the area that you have the experience in, but it's always going to have some gaps in the areas that aren't your background. If you product engineering, you might not have enough experience in enterprise sales. If you come from a sales background, you don't really understand the value of engineering or high quality design. And I think that understanding your gaps and trying to fill those gaps and listen to people who are experts is a hard thing to do, but it's important as you grow.
So, say somewhere out there is a passionate group of individual contributors who want to do the best thing. They want to make the best product and they want to spend that extra time and go that extra mile. But let's say their executive team may be not quite there in terms of appreciating or understanding that that is a requirement. What are the tools to potentially bridge that gap?
Yeah, yeah. I have been on the buying side doing due diligence of startups that have basically run out of money and they kept polishing the apple and making beautiful software that, they never got any revenue for. So I'm very sympathetic to, to both sides of the perspective. Ultimately, I think at a tactical level, if you are a mid-level engineering individual contributor or an engineering manager and you have a VP of engineering or a CTO or whatever above you, then you kind of don't really have to always take into account all of that stuff. You can just say, we really need this. This is what I want. This is my frustrations. And it's someone else's job above you to just worry about it and to deal with the trade-offs. Once you're on the leadership team, you're an executive, you're one of the principals, you can't just whine about all the things you want and complain that you're not getting everything you want. You need to put on your shareholder hat. You probably got some stock in the company, you got some options, whatever. You need to stop thinking like an engineer and you need to start, or a product manager, and you need to start thinking as a shareholder and say, like, if I was an investor in this company, what do I think the company should do, and how would I think about these decisions? And there are times where you even though you can tell that there's an area of your product that has a bunch of tech debt and it's kind of annoying to maintain. There's a part of your product, your tools for your internal administrators and your customer support is like kind of crappy and you feel bad about them and you want to make them better. There's times where you, as an engineer, or a designer or product manager, you're personally passionate about feeling like it needs to get better, but as a shareholder, as a stakeholder, as an executive in the company, you have to step back and say, just because I hate this doesn't mean it's where we should be investing resources as a company right now. There are times where the right decision is to hold off, to let it go for another year, map out a plan and a roadmap that eventually gets things where they need to be. But you can't just always demand the highest quality on every single thing. You have to pick your battles and choose the areas that are the most business critical this quarter and work on those this quarter, and make a case for what comes in the next quarter or the next year, as the roadmap cycles come up.
And you're mentioning the roadmap here and kind of like the vision for the product. How important is it to have like a longer term product vision, or as opposed to maybe changing things granularly every quarter?
Yeah.
Like, how do you find that balance?
Yeah, that one's that's another really tough area. That's also in my interview questions for product managers. Is what is an idealized roadmap cycle look like? I think it depends on the stage of the company. Obviously, at an earlier stage company, you're going to have to be a little bit more fluid in terms of your development. And in a larger publicly traded company, you're going to have to think on a little bit of longer time horizons. Generally, at a mid-stage startup, at an early stage, mid-stage startup, I tend to feel like making a plan with a 90% confidence that I'm going to hit all the dates. I feel like a quarter is about the best thing I can do. You can make a plan for a quarter that gets everyone together, gets everyone to commit, and has a social contract that says engineering, product design commits to get this set of done over this 3-month period. We will deliver it, high confidence that we'll deliver what we're saying when we're saying it. And the flip side of the social contract is everyone else in the company, all the stakeholders who got really bright ideas, you all commit to wait until the next quarterly cycle to come up with all the things that we should be doing differently to tip the apple cart. I feel like if you go longer than a quarter, like a startup that says this is what we're going to do over the next 12 months, it is, if the company is having any success, if you're growing at all, I guarantee you, your CEO, your head of sales, someone's going to come in within 8 months and say, I know we said we're going to do this, but super important, we got to go do this instead. I feel like committing to, say, a quarter with the right management of the personalities involved and expectation and the right communication, I think you can lock in a quarterly roadmap that's sort of set in, not necessarily stone, but let's say wood. And then 1 year roadmap that's kind of directional, that says, we intend to do this in Q3, we intend to do this in Q4, but things can change as you get to longer roadmaps. 5-year roadmaps, you throw those out to the VCs and investors, but it's the number of startups that actually followed their 5-year plan is pretty small.
What role does user research play in formulating the roadmap? The most successful companies that you worked at, have you done a lot of user research, or was it mostly kind of just the gut feeling and understanding of the internal team?
Yeah. I think that the earliest stages of all the companies I've worked at, including the more successful ones, you do a lot of shooting from the hip, gut at the beginning, and then eventually you start bringing in user research. I remember at Evernote the first time we did some user research where we had recordability user sessions with some users, and I remember sitting in a conference room watching the very first ones, just like pulling out my hair, like wanting to yell at the screen. People who loved our product and they were just using it wrong. They just didn't know what they were doing. So you're just like, no, click there, click there. Um, so I think that even a company that's having some success, that's vitally important. But I do think that that needs to be scheduled because it's one of the inputs to the roadmap process. It's one of the inputs to any given project, and for it to get into the roadmap, that you need to do enough research in advance to it could contribute to the prioritization, or else you just miss the boat. If you just wait around for a project to get funded with open-ended research and then maybe we'll do some work based on it, that tends not to get prioritized. Fundamental usability research can be a little bit hard to justify in a vacuum, but I think that there's things like that a savvy operator figures out how to bake into high value projects just as part of the price tag. Sometimes you need to do the usability research to even decide which projects to work on, what to fund. But then sometimes when you are funding a project and saying we're going to put this much resources in Q1, you put in a phase and you need to have the research component be part of the project. I've worked at companies where we treated the designers and UX resources as one of the types of resources that needed to get scheduled in every project. And most companies just can't afford to have people go out and just spin around forever without working on a schedule. If there's a 6-week period where at the end of it you need a report that says this, and this, and recommends whether to do X or Y, like that the social contract says that that has to be delivered, or else the people downstream are going to get screwed. The people doing the wireframes and the engineers and the QA and everyone else. You can't compress them just because the upstream research wasn't done. Obviously, one of the things that's really important if you're working on a quarterly process like I'm describing is it's real easy to justify short little projects because they fit in a quarter. Something that might take 15 months but have super great long-term value. How do you get that done if you're really only committing to quarterly work? I think that one of the arts is to break it down into sub projects that are actually achievable and measurable, and you can sign off on them within a quarterly cycle. So how do you decompose it into sub projects where each project fits within the planning period, each project fits within within a quarter, and that you can step back and evaluate it, and potentially sometimes you get 2 quarters of a large project done and you need to put it on the shelf and you can't return to it for 6 months. You typically need a champion who can think on the longer term. Your head of product needs to be able to think of longer term projects and figure out how to get enough bites of them so that they get done, even though you're operating on a quarterly cadence.
So would you say that in order to achieve that kind of smooth operation, to know where the product should evolve and to know how to break things down, it may be good for research and design perhaps to be a little bit ahead, like prototyping, doing user research before it becomes almost like a priority? Or do you think it's better for everybody to kind of move at the same cadence, so to speak, and look at what's in front?
Yeah, I think that there's sort of market research, there's product marketing type of things that can happen a little bit independently, that's sort of helping to figure out what we should be selling a year from now, 2 years from now. But I guess user research, where you're really looking at how the humans who will be interacting with your products, I've seen that be most successful not being free floating, but actually being attached to projects that do get rationally prioritized. So, I think that user research tied to a project that gets the go ahead for funding is going to be more successful than kind of free floating exploratory research, just because realistically, like resources that aren't contributing to something on the roadmap are more likely to get grabbed.
If we look at the disciplines, the design, engineering, product management, sometimes people talk about product-led organization, engineering-led,
Mm-hmm.
design-led.
Right.
Do you believe anyone should be leading, or is it about the synergy? Who should be leading who?
Yeah. Again, I think that I think that any discipline that is kind of leading is going to have its strengths, but it's also going to have its weaknesses. I've seen organizations where the decisions are fundamentally made by an independent head of product reporting to the CEO. I've seen organizations where it's really engineers building things and just slotting in product management and design as components in the life cycle. I've seen companies run by salespeople. I've seen companies run by MDs. I think that any of them can work, but the principals involved need to understand their biases and their mindset and be able to adapt and work with people who come from other backgrounds. I've seen successes and failures with all types of organizations. I think that there's some types of products that lend themselves better to one versus the other. If I were trying to build the next, Splunk or you know, some sort of like data processing tool that runs on AWS, that's probably a little more engineering led. Because like the engineer is the target audience of the product. You probably don't want that led by a head of design. But again, even there, I've evaluated startups for acquisitions that were heavily product led. I've looked at companies that were heavily engineer led. I've looked at ones that were heavily data science led, and I've seen lots of ways that companies can fail. So I don't think there's a magic recipe.
Does it come down to sometimes commercial team leading and dictating what needs to be built, or the marketing?
Well, that's a great example. I've seen companies that are led by commercial teams, and on one hand, they can they're closer to the market. They know what could be sold, but they don't have any experience understanding the value of building a general solution that could be adapted to different things versus doing a bunch of hacky one-offs. They might have read in an in-flight magazine that you can hire engineers in outer Mongolia for 10 cents an hour. So why the hell would we ever want to pay anyone in Silicon Valley? And I think that commercial bias, I've seen it result in, particularly in companies that do enterprise healthcare. I've seen it that it can result in a lot of expedient delivery of products to the market that check all the check boxes but become unmaintainable over time because the duct tape and baling wire needed for each one-off solution doesn't cohere into a single product. It's a bunch of random things. So if you ever want to do a refresh on the UX, it's not one user experience, it's 12 for all the random things that got sold to the market. But again, I'd say that Livongo is an example where our CEO, Glenn Tullman, was very industry commercial focused. That was a great success. But I've also seen companies that, they're commercial led that basically they've got mountains of tech debt and everybody can't understand why they can't get anything done today after building 48 half-baked products for every time a salesperson comes back from the road and said, "Great idea, we could totally sell this thing that we don't have today," and everyone just has to shut up and do it. That can be a gigantic failure.
What are some of the good structures that you've seen in terms of designers and engineers working together? Like, for example, I don't know, five engineers get assigned one designer and they just figure things out together, or more like a centralized design organization that serves multiple branches. Like, what have you seen
Right.
that worked well?
I've been in settings before where designers are brought in, product managers are brought in for an initiative, for a feature, but nobody really seems to own the app itself. So I remember one time, like an engineer came to me and is like, "We need some decision on what happens when you do such and such with the hamburger menu here." And it's like, this product manager and designer said we need to staple this into the app, and this one said we need to staple this, but like high level navigation wasn't in a quarterly initiative. It's just part of the app. And there wasn't a designer who's like, you know what, the iOS app is my baby. And I just like, nobody puts baby in the corner. I want it to be great. And like this week, I know this quarter, I know we're working on, the new, sharing to household pets feature, but ultimately, like, I want the entire application to feel consistent and great. And I'm gonna get my work done on the new features, but I'm also going to make sure that the entire thing still hangs together. And if that means doing some tweaks here or there to make the overall experience cohere, sometimes you just shut up and do it because it's your baby. Whereas I feel like if you've basically got a rotating pool of cooks coming in and throwing stuff into the pot, yeah, sometimes, like, even if each ingredient is perfectly fine, like the stew tastes like crap because nobody bothered to figure out how it all goes together.
For designers listening, what are the top things that engineers wished designers understood about them? Like kind of general guiding principles for how to improve the collaboration with engineering if you're a designer.
Quite frankly, I think that the one thing, if you were to just survey every engineer who works on a user-facing surface, punctuality and completeness would probably be the one thing that an engineer, like an engineer, like there's a roadmap, there's a schedule. The product ships on this date. It needs to be in QA's hand by this date. It needs to be such and such by this date. The engineers working on the mobile app need to have the APIs ready from the back end at this date. And like generally, once the roadmap process gets done, there's no padding left because all the stakeholders demanded every possible minute to squeeze every possible thing into the quarter or the year or whatever. So there's no real padding. Design tends to be the first tangible deliverable in a pipeline that ends on a release date with DevOps, and every minute that design hasn't delivered all of the assets and decisions squeezes everyone else in the funnel. If QA is late, they're pretty much the last step. The design is the start of the funnel. I guess product roadmap is the start of the funnel and the PRDs and everything, but the design is the first deliverable to engineers. And generally, the engineers can do a little bit of soft shoe before they get the final designs, but there comes a point where that when I've seen stress, it tends to be that we needed this screen and this menu and everything else. We needed it like 2 days ago. We don't have it yet. Like the designer doesn't report to my manager. I don't have it yet. I'm going to get blamed if this project's late. So I think that engineers tend to think about their sprints and their commitments pretty seriously. And I think anytime the upstream handoffs to them from design impact their ability to get on time, I think that's probably the biggest stressor I've seen.
So is it better to involve engineers like early on in the design process and share the direction, ask for ideas, or maybe better to work on it, complete it, hand it off? Like what is the balance there?
Yeah, I think that identifying the right engineers, the tech lead, having them closely involved and brainstorming with them, walk to coffee and virtual coffee or whatever, and shooting through ideas, like all that's great. I think that understanding what's going on is all good. I think that there's some engineers, some earlier career people that I've found exposing them to too much of the sausage making before they're ready can be a little bit hard. But I think that if the tech lead on a project can't handle that kind of a little bit of a back and forth interactive discussion, but that needs to be scheduled. If you're in the brainstorming phase and you're trying out some things and you're working on a few different prototypes, like that's all great. It's just like that needs to be scheduled.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Like it's a tricky balance, at least from the kind of design side, is that if you don't involve, sometimes there is a risk of sort of showing that presenting when things are already went through stakeholder review and then like, why are we doing it this way? There is a better way to do that. Or like, kind of, you kind of want to
Hmm.
get that buy-in as well to avoid the pushback. And sometimes if you involve too soon, then it also can add a unnecessary strain on the process for everybody. So it's a tricky one. I personally find it that it almost depends on the team and personalities, and you kind of just need to learn who you need to bring in sooner into discussion, who to ask to provide their idea, or maybe you just know that some people kind of just go along with whatever.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think that I was putting it in terms of seniority, in terms of like, yeah, your tech lead should be able to do that effectively. Because like if I were to build a ladder for engineers and say you're not ready to go from level 2 engineer to level 3 engineer unless you can handle this, like by the time someone is a senior engineer, a tech lead on a project, like if I can't stick them in a room with a designer at the right point in the schedule, so nothing's late yet, and have the designer just like have a casual talk with them to say, hey, I'm still thinking about some different things. Here's two different possibilities. Just want to get your feedback. Like if they can't go in that room and everybody comes out like feeling like they're working well together, then that person's not doing their job. Like again, like if everything's late, then then engineers have a right to be a little bit pissy. But if it's at the right point in the process, and you should be able to bring in you should be able to bring in the senior engineers, and with the right prefacing, that like we're thinking about a couple of different things. Here's a couple of different things we're trying. Just want to get your reaction. Is there anything here that would conflict with some other part of the technology stack that would bias us towards one versus the other? Is there anything here that that Apple would reject the application if we did it? Like I think that like they should be able to have that kind of a brainstorming.
You mentioned that you've seen throughout the years, I mean, you were obviously part of some great success, but also you've seen a lot of companies fail or things not
Yeah,
going necessarily the right way. What were some of the top reasons why it doesn't work out?
man, there's so many. Yeah, well, like I said, we had an online file storage company called Driveway during the first dot-com bubble, that we had our S1 file to go public, and then the entire market crashed, and yeah, 2001 there's a huge bubble burst, and a few months later we were selling off the furniture. I've worked a lot at kind of classic tech company VC backed, which tend to swing for a lot of upfront investment, swing for a lot of growth and valuation, and then if it doesn't work out, things go south really quickly. I've seen lots of, yeah, even when there might be an acquisition at the end of the tunnel, the acquisition is such that all the money goes to the investors and the creditors, and the employees don't get anything. So I think that there's varieties of what you might objectively consider to be a failure. But I do think that if you're working in this industry, you need to treat that kind of thing. You need to treat your stock options as like a handful of lottery tickets, and like don't don't assume any outcome for those. Let's put it this way: like you gotta do the work somewhere where you would be happy and proud of the work you did, even if the stock goes to nothing. And you quite frankly, we are extremely lucky to work in a field, in an industry where you can get paid well, you can pay your rent, you can eat fancy burritos whenever you want, and you also get a stack of lottery tickets, which maybe might result in something. But you got to do work that gives you some meaning, that work with people that you respect, that you don't hate your job, and a base pay that can cover a reasonable lifestyle. And then if one of the lottery tickets turns out to be something worthwhile, that's a pleasant surprise. But I don't think that the outcomes. I don't treat the outcomes of the companies I've worked at as even ones that didn't go where we would have liked to have gone. I don't necessarily treat them as failures.
You hint on a very interesting point that, like, even if you get the craft right, even if your product is great and people even like it and it's delightful experiences, in terms of the actual success, the commercial success, it may not necessarily.
Yeah, there's so much timing and luck involved. Evernote had a lot of luck early where we happened to be there ready to go with a favorable application at the launch of the mobile app stores. So we were in the iOS app store at launch with a nice pretty icon and a native iOS app that worked pretty well. But then eventually the luck swung against us there where we had trouble. Once we got to 20 million monthly users and a million monthly paid users, we had a hard time having more growth past that, and the fundraising we'd had up to that point didn't justify the valuation that we were at that level. I think that there's I think that it's real easy, like I said, to look at people from companies that have had success and just ascribe every success to perfectly brilliant decision making all the way along. But I think it's you need to work hard, you need to build something good, and then you need to get really lucky.
Yeah,
There's so
yeah,
many factors of timing and right place, right time, connections. There's every company I've been at that has had success, I can point to one or two or three things that if they hadn't happened to happen when they did, the outcome would have been entirely different, and they were outside of our control. So I think you make the conditions where if you are lucky, you can go with it. But there's plenty of times, there's plenty of examples of people who worked really hard, followed all the rules, built delightful products, and the timing was just wrong for them, or something outside their control happened that
yeah,
prevented them from getting where they wanted to go. So
yeah.
I think
Let's say you would be joining the next company. Would you rather work in healthcare or in a kind of a more general consumer mass market domain, or maybe another
yeah
field that you got
Yeah,
interested in?
I think that when you're working in a consumer application, it's more personally identifiable to you. You can make a product that you might want to use. You are a representative user. If you make it delightful and you put it out there, a certain number of people will use it. And I remember at Evernote we had a user conference and we had to warn our employees that they might have to deal with people coming up and giving them hugs. We'd have people showing up for the Evernote user conference. They just run up and hug an employee, and we had to make sure everybody at the company was ready for that. So I think that's personally satisfying. But at the end of the day, the impact on the world, making people a little bit more productive, making them communicate a little bit more. There's the mission statements of social media companies all read a little bit the same, and it's fine, nothing wrong with that. But I do feel like the one advantage of the healthcare industry, it's a horrible mess of of conflicted players that are fighting over a gigantic pile of 1/6 of the U.S. economy. But that if you build the right product, you don't just make people a little bit more delighted that in the social network for ferrets that you built. You can actually measure your successes in terms of clinical outcomes. You can measure your successes in terms of people who avoided a heart attack or at Livongo, for example, we could tens of thousands of people based on the actuarial tables I looked at over and over avoided having major medical complications because of how we help them manage their diabetes. I think that the day-to-day work of working in the healthcare industry is a whole lot less fun than working in a cool consumer facing application. But when I look back on what we may have done years later, I feel like I have a higher level of satisfaction in the work that I did. So I enjoyed doing that, but it's a trade-off. You're doing something that can be more frustrating on a day-to-day level to achieve. To maybe, if you're successful, you can maybe achieve something that you can measure in terms of real in costs.
Yeah, I think the level of challenges that healthcare brings, like I had a chance to work in kind of biotech, life sciences, gene therapy. Like, first of all, it's always different. It's like the healthcare is one single word, but like every single thing is so different. And it feels kind of less sexy on one hand, but at the same time, the challenges are deep and complicated. And for people
Mm.
who like the challenges, for people who like to be in complexity, I think, yeah, like healthcare offers a really great great area to explore. And plus, of course, it's easy to get behind the mission of most healthcare companies.
Yeah, the mission is great, but yeah, the mechanics of building something for the market and being successful is just miserable. Yeah, whether you're dealing with the processes for the FDA, or you're dealing with healthcare payers, or you're dealing, like, it's the nature of the market. Like, all the people involved are fine. It's just the nature of the market makes it, a lot more frustrating than building a cool little app and throwing it in the app store. It's, you come up with a cool app, you can put it in the app store tomorrow. You come up with a cool way to lower people's incidence of a stroke, and 3 years from now, if you're lucky, you might have your first customer.
Yeah, yeah. So I know you've transitioned from kind of manager, CTO roles into the individual contributor roles. Like, first of all, why did you decide to do that? And second is, do you find that maybe in terms of making that impact and in terms of making that influence, is it still possible being an individual contributor to bring that level of impact? And how would you compare that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Whenever I was managing engineers on my team, I'd ask about what their career goals were, and sometimes there'd be an engineer 2 years out of school. Then I'd ask what they want to do, and they'd say, they want to be an engineering manager, they want to be a VP of engineering, they want to be a CTO. And I'd always ask them, like, why, like, what is it about the work that you'd be doing in that role that is more motivating to you than being a deeper individual contributor. I think in the 1960s, the only career path for an engineer as they grew was to go into management. But I think there are companies now that realize that shoehorning your best engineers into a management track is really short-sighted. Your most successful engineers can be more productive than 10 of the 10 of your worst engineers. Forcing them to become a manager is counterproductive. So now a lot of organizations like Google, they have a career track where for each level of manager, there's an equivalent individual contributors, so you can get just as many pips on your epaulets, and you can get just as nice a parking spot and go to all the cool meetings without having to manage people. I do think that the people who had thought about it, a lot of times you have to value the craft of management. You have to value the seeing and the success of the people working for you. You have to value the growth, taking someone who's at this level in their career and helping them get to the next level of their career, who reports to you. You have to value a lot of process things that an individual contributor doesn't. And I think that, I if I had never done that, if I had only stayed as a programmer for my entire career, I would have always wondered why I didn't push myself and try that. But after 19 years as being a CTO, I decided, you know what, I'm kind of forcing myself to do all the parts of the job that I don't really love, like budgets and roadmaps and, yeah, performance evaluations. And I think I just want to focus. I always felt like I was doing 20 things kind of poorly, and I kind of wanted to just focus and do one or two things really well again. So I decided I could give myself permission to stop being an executive or a manager and just go back to being an engineer. So yeah, it's my last job over 2 years as just an individual contributor again. Yeah, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed, like, getting deep into solving one or two problems at a time rather than dealing with a fire hose of problems and interrupts like a manager does. But I do think that people should be intentional about their careers and realize that you don't necessarily need to become a manager to advance. There are options now for, not in every company, but in a lot of organizations, there are options to still progress and increase compensation and everything without going down that track.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for sharing. So, lastly, remote versus on-site. What do you believe it's
Boy,
possible to continue to make things happen purely remotely?
I think um, I think that I think that pure remote, where everyone is remote, everyone is a peer, versus everyone on site, are both perfectly justifiable options. The research makes a reasonable case that fundamentally, on average, I think the performance for a pure remote team on an individual basis is going to be 10% less than a well-managed on-site, but the costs might be 10% less. So a pure remote team that's a little larger than an in-house team, I think with the right support and management, you can get the same type of work done. But I think there's a lot of trade-offs. I do feel like in a pure remote setting, there's a little less engagement, a little less feeling of a commitment to the work and the colleagues. It just feels like you got a lot of little heads on your monitor. Like if I just want to pick up and leave and go to another job, I'm not letting the colleagues that I have lunch with down. I'm letting a bunch of little heads on my screen down that I've only seen twice during, meetups that, some offsite. So I do think that the level of engagement, attachment, and the productivity is a little bit lower, but the costs are commensurately lower. So I think it's legitimate. I think the one that doesn't really work is a bunch of people who work in an office and a bunch of people who are remote.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't get the advantages of being in person with 95% of your team. You don't get the cost savings of having a pure remote team. You kind of get the worst of both worlds. Personally, I'd rather either work somewhere where everybody's in the office together, at least 3 days a week on the same days and the same hours, so that we've got a bunch of in-person time, formal and informal. Or I'd rather just work completely remote. I think they can both work.
And final question, really brief. Like it can be literally a one sentence answer. Do you believe in inspiration? And if yes, what inspires you?
Wow, I haven't really thought about that. I don't think. I haven't thought about it enough to feel like I believe in inspiration bolt from the blue. I think that a lot of the mythology around eureka moments is overstated, and a lot of the I saw it in a dream and it would just sort of popped into my head. I feel like that's a bit overstated, and I think that true thinking in innovation tends to be more of an innovative, iterative process, even if it's only within your head. I think it tends to be less of a lightning from the blue and more of a thing you consciously or subconsciously work through over time, standing on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was great. Really a pleasure to do this.
Thank you.